and welcome in to another episode of Irrational Confidence. My name is Micah. I am joined, as always, by my fellow hosts and friends, Lino and Caelan, and we have a special guest today. We are joined by Noah Magaro-George. He covers the San Antonio Spurs since about 2019. He is the creator of the Vic and Roll podcast and Substack, and we are going to have a very Spurs-centric episode for you guys today, which is timely because the Spurs have been in the news quite a bit for good and bad reasons recently. So, Noah, thank you so much for being here today, and we're so excited to have you on.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for bringing me on. I always love talking about Spurs basketball in general. I know y'all love talking about basketball, so I'm excited and I'm ready to go.
All right, awesome. Well, we can get into the news first. A couple injuries from the jump, and one suspension that's a little odd. So, Joel Embiid has been suspended for 3 games by the NBA for an altercation with a media member. It was originally reported as a punch, but it seems like it was kind of a shove after a controversial piece was referenced by this specific writer. Definitely crossed some lines talking about Embiid's late brother and his son. So just an overall strange situation. So he was suspended 3 games, and then in other Philly news that is also unfortunate, Tyrese Maxey suffered a hamstring strain, so he's going to be out a few weeks. So it really might be closer to Thanksgiving that we get to see the Sixers' big three in full. So we'll see how that kind of transpires. Noah, what was your original kind of reaction when you heard this was happening in the locker room?
Yeah, I thought it was pretty wild that I mean, even as a writer, there's certain things you can say, there's certain things you can write about, but you never speak about somebody's late brother in the context of their legacy, right? Like, oh, him not being available on the court affects the legacy of his brother, and his son's named after his late brother. And yeah, just to me, it crossed a line. Do I think Embiid had to put his hands on somebody? No, but do I understand it? Absolutely. So I understand the suspension, but I also think the writer had an obligation to his profession, to the players who he's around a lot because he's in that locker room. He's part of the media scrum, day after day. He has an obligation to do his job in a way that's not disrespectful to the players, right? So I understand why Embiid did what he did.
Yeah, same here. I would have liked this press release more if it also included that this media member maybe had his credentials suspended or something. It feels like both parties could have gotten some punishment in this one. Another injury news we had was Aaron Gordon suffered a calf strain. He's going to be out multiple weeks. That is not stopping the Denver Nuggets from bludgeoning Leo and I's beloved Heat right now. So we're just going to move past that. Just assume a gigantic comeback's going to happen. But now we can get into the Spurs portion of the news segment. And the first part is a sad bit, and that is Jeremy Sohan suffered a fractured thumb. He's already had surgery. Not a clear timeline. Noah, what have you seen from Sohan so far this season, and how do you think the Spurs will kind of deal with his absence?
Yeah, I thought he was off to a really, really nice start. You could say he was taking sort of a leap, if you will. I don't know if he was anywhere near going to be an all-star player or anything like that, but he definitely looked like somebody who was more comfortable. Obviously, with everything that happened last season with the point guard experiment, that I think everybody sort of had to labor through that first 20 games where it was pretty clear he was not a point guard and he couldn't handle those duties, and they continue to kind of throw him into the fire and let him, simmer and burn, if you will, a little bit. But he's looked a lot better, just way more comfortable cutting, playing more naturally as a power forward, getting to be a roll man, getting to be a guy who makes those short roll passes, a guy who sets screens, who's active off ball. So I've really liked what I saw from him. And then defensively, like the first couple of years, there were definitely flashes here and there where he was guarding guys and you were like, yeah, there's something here. This guy's switchable. This guy can lock down, bigger wings. But this season, they really have thrown him on pretty much anyone and everyone who's the best scorer on the other team. And at least last time I checked, he was top 15 in defensive field goal percentage in the NBA among all players who've defended 50 shots so far this season, which is fantastic. He's holding his opponents to 41% from the floor, which that's great. League average is about 47. So I've been really happy with what I've seen, and that's what makes this such a bummer. Such a bummer that, and I know that we don't have an exact timeline from the Spurs, but from my understanding of the injury, it's going to be about 50 days. which is that's a lot of games. That's about 20, 21 games. That's a long chunk of the season.
Yeah, that's what I had seen as well as far as that absence. For good news, though, some reinforcements are on the way. It sounds like Devin Vassell will be available for the Spurs' next game. As a Florida State alum, I'm very excited that Devin is going to be back on the court. Noah, what can we look forward to with Devin's return coming off this foot surgery?
Yeah, just having maybe a semblance of an offense that is just not stuck in the mud. Because right now they don't have a lot of guys who can create advantages, who can score off the dribble, who can create something for themselves. And as much as I think everybody was really excited to see Chris Paul join the Spurs, if you're a Spurs fan, I mean, this is a Chris Paul who's almost 40, right? He's not the same guy who he was in New Orleans or Los Angeles or even his first couple go rounds in Phoenix. And I mean, you can tell he's not getting paint touches, right? And if your name's not Victor Wembanyama, then you're not really creating a lot for yourself. And even then, and I'm sure we'll talk about him, but Victor Wembanyama hasn't been particularly good on the offensive end either. So you look at a Spurs team that's bottom five in offensive efficiency, but really good on defense. Look, I'm glad they're back to defense, but the offense has been struggling. So I think getting Vassell back, that's huge. That's a 20 point per game score there. And at least it does something, or you hope it's going to do
Mhm.
something for them. So that's what we can look forward to for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think just on touching both of those players in Sohan and Vassell, it's very unfortunate that they're going to be two ships in the night for the next portion of the season. Because as I was watching the Spurs, I was like, this team is set up to thrive once they can figure out who to put on the floor offensively. And once these guys start to really develop their offensive game, once Wemby gets back to being more efficient, I think it can be pretty easy for talent like Wemby to get inefficient. We'll get more into that later, I imagine. But I agree that Sohan has got off to a very great start. And I've always been of the philosophy that throwing players like that into the fire, like you mentioned, in that guard role, has really shown to have benefits for players long term, whether or not you plan on running them at the point in the future. But if you can take a season and put somebody through that, they seem to develop a lot. And I think we've seen that in Scotty Barnes when he first had that season where they put him at the point position and it didn't look great for a while. But he came out of that season with a lot of new skills, and I think Sohan has shown that as well. So eventually, getting these two on the floor together is going to mean a lot for garnishing a few more wins. Me and Noah have talked about the win totals that we thought the Spurs were going to have this season, and they're projected to probably be a bit short of that right now. But I think the full picture of this team still looks pretty positive.
Yeah, well said. The last piece of news we have here is Greg Popovich is dealing with a health issue. He is going to be out an indefinite period of time per Shams Charania. Obviously, well wishes to Pop and his family. Definitely going to be thinking of him. In the interim, Mitch Johnson is going to serve as the Spurs head coach. Noah, what was your reaction to the news about Pop, and what do we need to know about Mitch Johnson?
Yeah, I mean the news about Pop, never good when somebody has a medical emergency. They have to be taken to the hospital. The Spurs have been pretty tight-lipped about this situation, and I would expect them to continue to be pretty, close to the vest about any details regarding Pop. So, the reporters have asked him, is he coming back this season? Is he coming back soon? Is he coming back in a month? And the Spurs just keep saying indefinite, indefinite, indefinite. We don't know, but he's going to be okay. So I think we can take some solace in knowing that he's going to be okay, but definitely scary for someone who, even 4 years ago became the oldest head coach in NBA history. I believe he's 76 or 77 now. So he's not a spring chicken anymore, but hopefully, he's okay. And the team says he's going to be okay in the long run. So I think that's all that really matters. But as far as Mitch Johnson, he's someone who I think Spurs fans can probably look forward to end up taking that mantle from Pop whenever that time does come, because he's a guy who's coached their summer league team. He's been one of the lead assistants the last 3 seasons. He's worked his way through the organization. He worked with DeJounte Murray quite extensively. They're both from that Washington area. He has a lot of familiarity with a lot of the basketball players from that area. He's got a lot of experience under his belt, right? Even though he's very, very young, but definitely a guy who I think will end up taking that mantle for Pop. Just seems to make the most sense. And even when you hear players talk about him, like Chris Paul talked in his latest press conference and was saying like, this is a guy who, when I was going against him and I wasn't with the Spurs, man, he was a know-it-all. Like, he knew all of our plays. He was calling our plays out. He was annoying, but I'm glad to be on his side now. Which, there's a little bit of media speak in that too. Everybody's media trained when you're a player, you're a coach, whatever. But I definitely think he's somebody who fans can be excited for in the future. But as for now, at least from what we've seen on the court, he's still predominantly running the Pop system. It's a lot of the same plays, a lot of the same offensive principles. So I don't know how much we're going to see of him, at least as far as his unique style. But I'm excited to see what he can do.
Nice. Caelan, do you think is there a certain thing you look for when an interim coach takes over? And it can be specifically in the Spurs situation, or is there just something you'd like to see them bring, maybe different from the head coach, or just to perpetuate what they've been doing?
Yeah, I think in this particular situation, it is going to be difficult because the rotations are going to be very tough. I think that they have a lot of players with talent on this team, but they don't necessarily fit seamlessly together. So that is going to be a tough job, and hopefully Pop can get back soon, because that's going to be one of the things that they need to figure out to really get Wemby going.
Nice. Yeah. Well, now that we are up to date on all the news and notes, we're going to hop in a time machine a little bit and kind of go through what has led us to this Spurs season. And we're actually going to start with what has led Noah specifically to this Spurs season. So, Noah, we want to know, just as fans and people that also like producing content around the NBA, what has kind of been your journey to get to where you are now in your career, where you're credentialed, you're covering the Spurs, you have your own podcast, your Substack, what has all gone into that for you?
Yeah, it's been a pretty winding road. So originally I went to the University of North Texas. I studied broadcast journalism there. And when I graduated, I was looking at a job in radio. I was one of the finalists for a spot over at the KRLD station here in Dallas. I was going to be doing straight news. I wasn't going to be doing anything to do with the sports. And then the pandemic happened, and they decided that was not a role that was going to be existing anymore. So I was at home, like many of us during the pandemic. I was like, hey, I'm from San Antonio. I've followed the Spurs forever. I love basketball. I'm just going to like kind of tweet and write about the Spurs in any way I can here or there. I ended up getting an opportunity with an online blog. I moved on to Air Alamo. Then I moved to Pounding the Rock. And it wasn't until I got to Pounding the Rock that I got opportunities to go to games in person, go to the Summer League in Las Vegas. And really, I saw myself really just go from like 400, 500, 600 followers to, one season, like 5,000, 6,000 to now I think like close to 16,000. So it's just, I think about hitting like consistent content, right? Just like putting stuff out there consistently, showing people, what you're talking about. And yeah, it hasn't definitely not been a straight path. And I left the world of contract writing in 2023 at the very end of last year. And I decided I want to start my own thing. I want to see what I can do on my own. I don't want to be writing on other people's terms or podcasting or making videos on other people's terms. So yeah, I started the Vic and Roll, started making videos, podcast articles. And honestly, I've loved it. I've loved the creative freedom. I've loved the ability to kind of go on my own schedule, but in that same breath, I've had to do other jobs on the side to make sure that we're still got money coming in. So yeah, it's been a little bit tough making it work, but hey, I wouldn't trade it for anything. It's been awesome. It really has been.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where if covering something you love is so fulfilling, but also like you said, we do got to make sure the bills are paid. So definitely get where you're coming from there. I wanted to ask, since you've been covering the team, was there a specific moment, whether it was kind of like, I've arrived, I'm doing well, or just one where you were kind of in shock, like you were in the room with, player or person X? Did you kind of ever have like that one standalone wow moment?
Definitely. Yeah. So in 2021, I had kind of decided like, hey, I want to try to do this as full time as I can. And so heading into that 2021, 2022 season, I was like, hey, I'm going to go to Summer League in Las Vegas. I'm going to go whether or not I get credentialed. I'm going to try to figure out, what does it look like financially? And then I'm just going to tell people like, hey, I'm going to pay out of pocket, but if you want to help me get there, like a couple bucks here or there will help me pay for food. It might help me pay for a ticket to Las Vegas Summer League and get the 10-day pass, whatever. And I kind of figured, maybe I'd get $50 or $100, and all these people came together, people who I didn't even really realize were looking at my work or following me like that, and raised almost $3,000, and they paid for my whole, the flight, the hotel, the food, the tickets. And that was really a humbling moment, but also a moment that I was like, wow, like I think at least some people care about what I'm writing about, right? Like I was like, man, people care what I'm saying, people care what I'm writing, podcasting, making videos. Like it was just a moment that I was sitting at home and I was like, wow, like I can't believe that people care. So that was definitely my, like, I've sort of arrived, if you will, moment. I definitely don't think I'm no Bill Simmons, I'm no Stephen A. Smith, I'm not like on that level, but that was definitely one of the moments that I'll look back on and I go like, yeah, I mean, it just incredible feeling that you can't really match, right? So that definitely is that moment for me.
Man, that
That's
is awesome. And I feel like what I've loved so much about your journey so far, and just the way what assume your followers and audience are really gravitating towards, is just, I love the way that you talk about the Spurs from not only a technical standpoint, but even throughout just this past season. We met kind of towards the tail end of last season and through the off season for this Spurs iteration. And, I feel like it's a very unique situation to be in with the Spurs, because I'm sure you
Definitely.
spent your whole life being incredibly optimistic about the Spurs' opportunities to win a ton of championships. And so to be in this kind of rebuilding phase, I feel like you've always approached the game and this team with an optimism, even when you're being transparent about where there's flaws. There's always kind of a sense of at least an attempt to find hope in whatever is going on this team. And
Yeah.
that's kind of tough to find with writing. I mean, especially when misery kind of sells in this industry. I feel like it's important to be able to, and a big reason why we even started this show was to be able to garner excitement in even a team that might not win more than 26 games a season, or if your team wins 40 games a season, or if you are an actual contender, being able to generate excitement for our league is, I think, the most important job that we have as content creators for the NBA. And I think other leagues tend to do that a little bit better than we do
Yeah.
across the board. And so I always really appreciated that whenever we have those conversations, you never, on the surface down in the dumps about the Spurs.
No,
In
and
the
and
way
I
that,
think that is important, right? That's so important to keep people engaged, because I do think it's really easy to be doom and gloom and just like capitalize on people being upset, right? Just get them fired
Mhm.
up over something that's supposed to be fun. It's a game. Like these are
Yeah.
grown men bouncing a ball, a sport that was invented on a peach basket. Like it's I mean, it's important to us, but it's not at the end of the day that serious. So I do think it is important to be optimistic. I always try to be realistic, but like you
Hmm.
said, have that little spin of optimism, whether it's, oh, Mamu has been really fun. Is he like a point center? Like I never want to sell something that somebody's not or that a team's not. Like I'm always honest with what I'm saying, but it is important to give people at least some hope, right? You've got Wemby. That's the greatest hope you
Hmm.
can have. Now let's build something around that. So no, I agree with you 100%. It's so much nicer to listen. And that's one of the things that I like when I talk to you about basketball too, is like, not everything has to be so negative. And it is,
Hmm.
like you said, so easy to be negative and then get everybody to listen to you, because people love to get fired up over things that don't matter.
Yeah, and I won't pretend that we don't get highly negative on this show when it comes to a lot, especially our own team specifically. But
I never
we
do that.
do, yeah, Caelan is actually the most positive of the three of us.
Thank you.
But no,
It's
that's
not easy.
awesome. Like I mentioned, we talked a lot about we kind of met in this off season towards the end of last season. So we've had a few discussions just about how this off season went for the Spurs, the draft, the summer league, and things of that nature. So we'd love to hear a little bit more on your thoughts regarding, going into this season, how you felt about the Spurs, the decisions that they made, some of their free agency signings, and the rookies that they brought on board.
Yeah, I definitely think one of the things that they had to address was just getting some adults in the room, if you will, right? Like they were the
Hmm.
youngest team or the second youngest team in the NBA last season. Not a lot of veteran leadership. And like that's no shade to guys like Doug McDermott or Chetty Osman, but those guys don't necessarily command the room like someone like Chris Paul, who's a future Hall of Famer, Harrison Barnes, who I think honestly gets overlooked a lot as far as like career achievements. He's a McDonald's All-American. He's a guy who played for Roy Williams. He's won an NBA championship. He's won a gold medal with Team USA. He's a guy who's been around the NBA for over 12 years. He's been in the playoffs pretty consistently throughout his career. So those two guys in comparison to, again, to someone like a Doug McDermott or a Chetty Osman, that's a huge difference. Just the leadership, the sort of knowledge that they're able to impart with the amount of success that they've had in the league. So when I saw them go after those two guys and they were able to acquire them, I thought that's good. That's good for culture. That's good for kind of teaching the younger guys how to win. We saw that Spurs team last season have leads going into the third quarter or have big leads going into the fourth quarter, and they just didn't know how to finish it off. They kind of got sped up when the game slowed down, tons of turnovers, bad shots, no one to calm them down. So I thought that was pretty big. Now, I will be honest with y'all. I thought the real most important thing they had to address was spacing, because they were a terrible shooting team last season. And of course, Chetty Osman's gone. Doug McDermott's gone. They're starting the season without Devin Vassell. They added Riley Minix as a two-way guy who's probably one of the best shooters who will not see the floor just for other reasons. Obviously, two-way guy, probably not going to see a lot of minutes. They didn't add a lot of shooting. Like, they were just hoping for a lot of internal development, I think, on that front, or they were willing to wait a little bit, or maybe they dipped their toes in the trade market at the trade deadline. But I did not think they did a good job addressing that. And even though the last couple of games have been pretty solid from them from three, you look around the roster, not a lot of shooters. And even the guys who are shooting a fairly good percentage, they're not very shot versatile, right? They're not shooting off the
Mhm.
move. They're not relocating. You can't run them off of screens. You're not going to find them running in transition. They're mostly stationary, standstill guys. So I thought that they definitely should have addressed that, but there's only so much you can do. And I think they did a fairly good job of adding more talent and also adding that veteran leadership that they were missing.
No,
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up that veteran leadership piece because I think not only did they do such a great job of bringing in two veterans that do have maybe a little bit more to share with the young players, and you mentioned like Shetty Osman, Doug McDermott, like those are great players. They're just not exactly going to have a lot to contribute to how these guys can get better. They could probably teach you how to play like Doug McDermott, but that's not exactly what you need right now. And so that kind of caliber of talent, but also the timeline for that talent as veterans as well. Because when we look across, down the highway to the Houston Rockets, I don't think it's been the worst thing in the world that they brought in Fred VanVleet and Dylan Brooks, but you can kind of see two timelines kind of butting heads there, in which those two players still really want the ball as much as possible
Yeah.
whenever they can. And I do think they probably get more wins because of it, but they do sacrifice development in that way. Whereas Chris Paul and Harrison Barnes, those are not really things you have to worry about for those guys at this stage of their career. So yeah, I was excited about that. But Michael, what have you kind of thought about how this team was put together going into the season and some of the moves they made?
Yeah, for me, I think the most important things that the Spurs had to, decide what to do with this past offseason was the number 4 and the number 8 pick in the draft, and what kind of direction they wanted to go in, how they wanted to build this team around Wemby. This is their first, I believe, their first picks in, post Wemby. So what kind of infrastructure do you want around him? Of course, he's such a unicorn. You could go really any different way. But of course, we know that he ultimately decided to draft Stephon Castle at 4 and then trade number 8 to get future draft capital from Minnesota. So, Noah, I wanted to know, I actually was listening to your podcast with Nate Duncan when you said that wouldn't have been your pick at 4. So it made me wonder, what would you have done at 4? Would you have kept 8? What did you think of the Spurs draft?
Well, honestly, I thought the Spurs on draft night, my initial reaction was, okay, I'm fine with Stephon Castle at 4 because I had him 5 on my big board. So it wasn't that big of a deal. There wasn't a big difference between who I had above him and who they ended up taking. And the guy above him, full disclosure, for me was Rob Dillingham. I think he made the most sense next to a guy like Wemby if you weren't going to bring in Chris Paul. And even if you did bring in Chris Paul, having someone like Rob Dillingham who has shown playmaking ability, especially being able to make live dribble passes with either hand, and a guy who can pull up off the dribble in a sort of, I'm not going to say Trae Young, because obviously that guy is an all-star, superstar level player, but someone who's kind of in that, maybe we'll say Anthony Simons sort of vein, who can pull up off the dribble, play make a little bit. Like, working with Chris Paul would have been fantastic. So when I saw that they got Dillingham at 8, I was like, oh, awesome. They've got Dillingham and they've got Castle, the two guys who I kind of wanted them to go after. And then they traded Dillingham, and I was like, well, that's a little bit of a bummer, but I definitely understand it. You're getting a 2031 and 2032 pick out of that from the Minnesota Timberwolves, and who knows where they're going to be, right? Like, who knows where the Timberwolves are going to be at
Right.
that point? Those players who are going to be drafted in that draft too, they're in middle school right now, I think. So yeah, they've got a ton of time to kind of figure out what they're working with there. So even though I was a little disappointed that they didn't walk away with Dillingham and Castle, I really like the idea of having Castle. My only sort of hang up there, and we can talk about this a little bit because I'd love to know what y'all think of him as well. Can he be a full-time point guard, or is he more like a Lonzo Ball type who is a connector and a absolute pest at the point of attack as a defender? Like, is that who he is, but can't shoot? And then if that is who he is, how valuable is that? So that was my only hang up, but the Spurs really liked him. They've spoke highly of him. So I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, right? There's a reason they're getting paid big bucks to scout, and I'm over here building a website. They're on a different level than I am.
Yeah, the Spurs definitely have more self-control than I do, because if Dillingham would have been there at 8, I definitely would have just, put in the call. I wouldn't have had the foresight to get future picks for that. I think it's a fun time to get into Stephon Castle, though, and kind of talk about what we've seen from him so far. Caelan, I'll throw it to you first. I know we've all been watching a ton of Spurs lately. What have you
Right.
thought of Castle so far?
So I don't watch college basketball really at all. So I don't get a chance to kind of see any of these guys until they get to the league. So it was kind of surprising to see that Stephon Castle is a very mature player for a rookie. He really plays within himself, stays in control. And I understand what you're saying, Noah, about, is he a full-time point guard? It seems to me like that could be in his future right now. It seems like he's just trying to make the right play and stay within himself. And he also is playing next to Chris Paul, who is handling some of those duties as well. So right now, I think that he is doing a pretty good job. I think that he could potentially grow into more of a scorer. I think that would be really important. But from what we've seen right now, I do like what I've seen from Stephon Castle. Sure.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think there's certain guys in this draft class, because this is not, the top end talent draft
Yeah.
class of, the past few years that we've seen. But there's certain guys who get on the floor immediately and just get it. I think Dalton Connect was one of those guys who showed it early from the Lakers, as far as, statistically not amazing, but when he's on the floor, he just looks like he understands how NBA basketball is supposed to work. And Stephon Castle's another one of those guys. His numbers don't look amazing. The shooting is rough. And that was probably the highest critique of a team that needs shooting like this, not drafting any. It feels like the Spurs maybe overthought it a little bit. I think the needs are pretty simple, but this is a talented guy who I'm sure came to training camp or came to those draft workouts and really impressed them just with how clearly he understands the game of basketball, especially on the defensive end, but even being in the right places on offense. The fact that he's in those spots, getting in position, cutting at the right time, and honestly making plays with the ball. The shooting is one of those things that can come along. Those other elements, especially with just knowing where to be on the floor during a basketball game, is one of the most underrated things I think we can expect from a young player like this. So I've been pretty excited. The shooting, I'm really not sure if it comes along, and I don't know what kind of minutes he's going to be able to carve out for himself if he can't figure it out. But he's with a great coaching staff that knows how to develop young players, so that's something that could show up eventually. But right now, it is a bit concerning. Micah, what have you thought so far of Castle?
Yes, speaking of that coaching staff, if Chip England was still on the coaching staff, I would feel a little better about the shooting prospects. But yeah, for me, I don't know if Stephon Castle would like this comp, but I've really liked how they've used him in almost like a Brooklyn Bruce Brown role with these inverted pick and rolls
Mhm.
with Wemby. He's been really good making decisions out of the short roll. Like, he obviously has passing chops, even though he wasn't like a full-time point guard at UConn, but it's been fun to see them kind of use Wemby's gravity to create space for Castle to really dime guys up in the middle of the court. The defense is definitely there. There's no questions there. I know, coming out of UConn, there was people didn't know if there was going to be a lot of event creation, but I've been very pleased with what you've seen. Picking up some tough assignments. Honestly, they've kind of thrown him into the fire, especially after Sohan went down. He's been starting and dealing with some tough matchups. So, been impressed on that end. The passing looks good. It's just the shot. It's what we've been saying since he was at UConn. And I think there is something to, yes, you want to develop the shot. You don't want him to be afraid to take the shot. But especially in the NBA, there's a learning curve to knowing how to be an effective non-shooter. You see guys like, Draymond Green, somebody, it's like been an incredible, like he'll catch in the corner and he's not going to shoot it, but he'll pitch it to somebody. They'll get into a screening action or a DHO, or he'll make a timely cut. And I think Castle has shown some very smart court mapping and how to know, maybe I don't need to get up a ton of threes, but I can pick my spots on the offensive end to attack.
Yeah, I think y'all are absolutely hitting the nail on the head there. I think he is a guy who's super high feel. He understands the game. Even if you did watch his UConn tape, he was a guy who really wasn't a full-time point guard there, but you could see him, how valuable he was as a connector, as you're talking about, a guard screener, a guy who's being used in inverted pick and rolls, making passes on the short roll, a guy who's cutting all over the floor, who understands how to run the lanes in transition, who understands the second he sees the back of his defender's head, he's cutting to the basket, right? He just gets the game. He gets the game. He doesn't make a ton of mistakes. He's not taking a ton of risks. So I like him from that perspective for sure. I do think the Bruce Brown comp that you threw out there, I do like that. That is it. But at the end of the day, I do wonder, how valuable is that player? Is he worth being taken at 4? I think in this class, yes, especially because he can have more value than that if he does end up developing a jumper. But at least the early returns on the jumper haven't been very good. I think he's shooting about 12.5% from 3 on almost 3 attempts per game. So he's not been super shy about shooting the 3. He's shooting it when he's open, which is something that I can respect, because at UConn, I think most of his turnovers were just him traveling, not knowing whether to shoot it or to drive, and he got caught somewhere in between and just traveled, right? So I'm fine with him shooting them. He's taken a few off the bounce. He's taken a few mid-range jumpers off the bounce. That has not looked very good either. The finishing at the rim has been a little concerning too, but at the end of the day, he is someone who I think just turned 20. He was just a teenager, right? Like he had a pretty limited role at UConn, and now the Spurs are asking him to do a lot more with Sohan out, with Devin Vassell out. Like you said, he got his first start the other night. So I'm willing to be patient. And I think in 9 games into a season, right, it's too early to be doing victory laps for anybody or saying, oh, this guy's done. Like, he's a bust. So I think there have been a lot of promising things with him. And I'm willing to be patient. I think that's the number one thing that I'd love to see people do a little bit more. Just be patient. Like, guys are coming in the league younger than they ever have. So if you're willing to be patient, you'll probably get a good idea of who they are. Maybe not year 1, but year 2, year 3.
Yeah, there's definitely the framework there. And you brought up something that made me think. Honestly, earlier I said I feel like the Spurs maybe overthought the pick, but just in these 9 games, within like the top 5, top 8 players that were drafted, there hasn't been incredible shooting performances from anybody. So
No.
there's not exactly, unless they went and got a shooting specialist. But you just don't take that kind of guy with a number 4 pick or a number 8 pick. You need someone as well rounded as someone like Castle. So overall, I think it is going to pan out for him for sure.
Yeah, well said. Well, speaking of exciting young Spurs players, I think we've gone long enough. It is time to deep dive into Victor Wembanyama, probably the most exciting player in the NBA, certainly the most exciting prospect we've had in a very long time. And Victor has had, I would say, maybe a polarizing season so far. There's a lot to get into it. Noah, I want to just open it up with you first. What have just kind of been your general impressions from year 2 of Victor Wembanyama?
I think year 2, Victor Wembanyama has definitely come out of the gates a little bit slow. He was a slow starter last season. I don't know if people remember, because it's easy to remember what happened most recently, which was the Paris Olympics, where he looked pretty dominant. And then you got the end of the season where he had that 40-point game against the Knicks, where he had that game against the Nuggets, where he pretty much carried the Spurs to victory, and it ended up determining the number 1 and number 2 seed in the Western Conference playoffs, right? Like, so it's easy to remember those things and go like, what happened? Why isn't he? But even Vic has said, hey, I'm a slow starter, and we're just trying to get me comfortable out there. And I think there is something to, like, not having Devin Vassell, not having Jeremy Sohan, not having Trey Jones. Malachi Branham is now out as well, who's been pretty integral for the Spurs off the bench. And then also Chris Paul, I think has, and again, I know this is a little bit of maybe a little bit of a non sequitur, but I don't think people realize how hard it is to just like make an accurate pass to someone you've never played with, let alone someone who's 7'4", 7'5". Because last year the national narrative was like, these guys can't hit Wemby, they can't find Wemby. And if you're watching these Spurs games, like Chris Paul has been pretty good at finding Wemby, but there have been a ton of passes where he just hasn't put it exactly where Wemby needs it, where it's either a little too high, a little too low. It's resulted in turnovers. And so I think even looking at it like that, like just adding Chris Paul was never going to be the answer. Has it helped? Absolutely. But I think Wemby in that same, people have to get used to playing with Wemby. So he
Mhm.
hasn't really reached that yet. And I think Wemby also just, the shot selection has been wild. A little bit out of necessity, because again, we talked about it earlier. The shot creation just isn't there for anybody outside of Wemby. But even if you look at Wemby in a vacuum, like he's not a guy who really is built to create off the dribble. Like his handle's not super tight. He's not like getting super low. Guys can get under his dribble and poke it free. He's not super strong. So like, he's not I don't think he's built to just go, hey, here's the ball, go create offense. Like I don't think that's his game, at least not right now.
Yeah, I think. Go ahead.
No, so I actually did just kind of want to push back a little on one thing. The Chris Paul and Wemby fit, I'm not sure I love it. I am a big proponent of the veteran presence on the team, but I think the way that Chris Paul wants to play doesn't necessarily fit this team. A bunch of young guys, they played with pace last season, and obviously Chris Paul wants to kind of slow it down and kind of analyze things. And I think a lot of times when they do get Wemby the ball, it's just it maybe lacks creativity. They're not doing, I think, a ton to help him. Sometimes I think teams can fall into that when they do have a great player that can do so much with the ball. They, kind of just get it to him and kind of want him to go to work. I think the Spurs could do a little more with that. And but before Sohan went down, I thought it was interesting too. Sohan was playing very well, but um, you know, I wonder about that Sohan and Wemby pairing too. Sohan can kind
Yeah.
of gum things up, and obviously we want Wemby to take more shots at the rim. He's shooting a high percentage at the rim. He's just not taking enough shots down there. So I think obviously they got to figure out how to get Wemby going downhill more, and I think just playing with pace could kind of help do that.
I agree. I'm right there with you. I think 100% the Spurs have played a lot slower this season. Last year, they were top 3 in pace. Right now, they're 25th in pace. They haven't looked particularly good. And again, I think some of it is Devin Vassell, but I do think you're onto something, that some of it is Chris Paul. Like you look at individual player pace in the NBA this season, Chris Paul's number 379 out of about 450-ish players. Like he
Wow.
wants to slow things down. He wants to get things going in the half court. And a lot of times, like for example, last season, Wemby was number 1 among centers and power forwards in points per game in transition. This season, he's not even in the top 40. And that's a problem. Like if you can't create easy offense for him, it's going to be a struggle, especially without a Devin Vassell, without a Jeremy Sohan. And I'm also glad you brought up Jeremy Sohan, because I think a lot of people in Spurs Twitter, Spurs universe, Spurs fandom tend to think I'm a bit of a hater. But when I look at Jeremy Sohan, I think awesome start to the season. But like you said, how good of a fit is it though? Because he's not spacing the floor. There's not a lot of other guys spacing the floor. So you're shrinking the space for this guy. You're allowing guys to be able to dig from way closer than they would otherwise. They're able to sag off their defender, their assignment. And look, Sohan's been great as a cutter. He's been really solid as a roll man, but teams have been very happy to leave him wide open from 3. And Sohan has decided this season that, like, I'm fine to shoot less threes. And so if he's shooting less threes on worse efficiency, and he's mostly operating around the basket, which is where, Wembanyama's been the most efficient, is that a good fit? Like that is a genuine question. And that's a thing that myself and my co-host Gabe have talked about time and time again. So I'm not saying that like Sohan cannot be a fit next to Wemby, but if it's going to work, they got to figure something else out with the rest of the personnel. Because if it's Chris Paul and Sohan, and Wemby out there all together, like it's a little bit junky, right? Like it mucks things up a bit. So I'm glad you brought that up. I was a little hesitant to say anything, but I'm glad you brought it up because I'm all, I'm ready to talk about anything.
Nice. Yeah, it's crazy watching Wimby off ball, especially in the paint, because he has it's almost like Steph gravity, except instead of the 3-point line, even off ball, he has two people with him at the paint at all times, sometimes three before the catch. But it's partially how incredible Wimby is, and it's also because they're not super afraid to leave those guys on the weak side, like you were talking about. So it's definitely a concern. I started off being Lino and Caelan can attest to this, being very critical of the Wembanyama shot selection, because I was just like, what is this guy? Like the pull up three after, we had the Heat Spurs preseason game. I think Wemby's first shot was a pull up three. And I was just perplexed. But of course, we've been diving deeper into it in preparation for the show. And it's almost like that bell curve meme where you are like, oh, it's a bad shot. And then you come all the way back around to like, well, what else is he supposed to do? There's not, he at least got a shot off. So
Yeah, and I think
Yeah,
it's actually really interesting, and I'll let you finish here in a second. But if you look at his numbers from last season, as far as pull up twos and pull up threes per game, they're actually higher last season than they are this season. And so I think a lot of people have watched the beginning and been like, man, these are real, like he's taking a ton. I don't think it's necessarily that he's taking more because the data would say that's not true, but I do think he's taking tougher pull-up threes and tougher pull-up twos where like he's being thrown these grenades at the end of the shot clock and they're like, hey, why don't you go do something with like 2 seconds left, 3 seconds left. And like, that's all he can do. So I definitely think the quality of the shot there, not necessarily of his own fault, has definitely brought attention to like, wow, why is he shooting so many of those? Well, that's kind of why.
Yeah, absolutely. And like Micah said, I was probably the first person to call Micah a hater for challenging Wemby's shot diet because I personally think the shot diet is fine. I'll say it. I don't know if you guys have that meme of that like union worker like standing up with a piece of paper. But I personally think it's just fine. I think that Wemby is a very special talent. And yes, he's 7'4", and yes, it'd be way easier for him to score at the basket, but he's not a generational talent because he can dunk the ball and be running dunk man. We have those in the league right now. We have centers that are tall that can, manipulate the post. Wemby's special because he does have an ability to dribble a basketball. He can shoot from deep and he can play more like KD. People say like stop trying to play like KD and play more like AD. Playing like KD is pretty dang good when the shot goes in. And all of our favorite highlights from Wemby is, tween behind the back, step back three, and you're like, that guy's 7'4". How did he do that? He does that because he takes those shots. And, I do agree. You could probably mix it up a little bit better, but as we've discussed, the ability to do so is very dampened by who he's sharing the floor with at this time. So I think once those shots start going in, and the efficiency comes up, which I do think it can because he's incredibly talented, the tone of voice about his shot diet is going to change completely, and we're going to go back to being completely amazed at how he's able to do any of this at all.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. And I think to me also something that I find myself while I'm watching Spurs games thinking is like, okay, if I'm being critical of these shots, let me look at this possession from the lens of like, okay, what is an optimized version of this? And then you kind of get into for the long-term success of San Antonio, is it better to have like a very almost watered down optimized version of Wemby where he's just like a role guy, or long term is it better for him to explore this studio space, figure out what, quote unquote bad shots he's comfortable with? Because honestly, if we turned Wemby into just like a straight devastating role player catching lobs every game, how many more wins is that this season for San Antonio? Probably not that many more. So it's like, how do you kind of suss out, is it worth it for him to kind of explore these spaces and see how he could go from there? Noah, is there anything you've seen schematically, different actions you wish San Antonio would lean into more to get Wemby maybe higher quality shots?
Honestly, I feel it, and we can kind of talk about later how I watch games, but from what I've watched so far, they've run pretty much a lot of the same actions that they did last season, and nothing last season was that complicated. I actually think a lot of times they were at their best when they had Doug McDermott out there and Devin Vassell out there, where they had two guys who they can run actions with, whether that's like a twirl action where you have to worry about two shooters, one guy coming off of a screen, whether that's a pin down for a guy and then a flare for another guy. Like they had guys who, okay, you can't just leave them open. And now Wemby has some more room to work with, whether that's near the elbows, whether that's on the low block. This season, they don't have that. Like the closest approximation they have to that is Julian Champagny. And as much as I love Julian Champagny, and at times I think, man, this guy could be like the second coming of Danny Green, he's also very similar to Danny Green in the nickname that he used to have in San Antonio, which was icy hot. One game he's going to go 0 of 7 from 3. The next he's going to be 5 of 7 from 3. Like you never know what you're going to get from Julian Champagny. Like the opening game against the Mavericks, he was like 4 of 6 from 3, had 20 something points. And then the next couple of games, he was like 1 of 15 combined from 3. And then the last 2 games, he's made 8 threes and it combined. Right. So like you never know what you're going to get from him. Whereas with Doug McDermott, Devin Vassell, a lot more consistency game from game, even if they didn't have necessarily as much shot versatility as a guy like Doug McDermott. So just not having the personnel to get as creative, I think, has really watered down the offense. And in some ways also really allowed the defense, again, like we've talked about, to kind of sag off guys in the corners, sag off guys above the break and just try to muck things up for Wemby, like make his life harder, push him out off the block, push him off his spot on the elbow, make him catch it closer to the perimeter than where he's comfortable operating. So schematically, I think it's been pretty similar, but when you're working with lesser personnel, I think it makes it a lot tougher to make those things work.
Yeah, I have loved whenever they've been able to get Wemby on the move. There are a couple possessions, I think back to back in the Blazers game where Harrison Barnes was setting a screen for Wemby in the corner. And the first time he flies off of it, gets an and one, just kind of walks over Jeremy Grant. And then the next time, same possession, the Blazers overreact, both go with him, and he gets Harrison Barnes an open corner 3. Stuff like that I really enjoyed seeing. And I know you can't spam the same thing over and over again, but anything getting Wemby on the move, it's incredible. You really can't stop it.
Yeah.
No, I agree. And I think one of the plays that they use pretty often coming out of like timeouts or after free throws, it's a play called Horns pinch flex, where they have them set up at the elbows and then they have Wemby stationed in the corner. And then after a guy catches it on the right elbow, they'll have him curl off of this flex screen from the corner and try to get him running towards the basket so he has momentum, and hopefully he can just finish over someone who's smaller with that screen catching someone, and now someone's trailing him. So they've used that a lot this season. Unfortunately, it feels like every game they're turning to that like 6-7 times, and teams are kind of like, all right, like what's what other trick do you have for us? And I do think they've run some fun things here and there. The other day they ran this zoom action for Wemby, which is typically something you see for a guard to get them downhill, but they used it for Wemby. He got downhill, he dunked all over. I can't remember if it was Şengün or Jabari Smith Jr., but it was in that Rockets game, and I was like, okay, like yeah, if they're really intent upon Wemby, and they've talked, the Spurs coaching staff, whether it's Mitch Johnson, whether it's Coach Popovich, talked about, we see him more as a big or as a wing than a big man. Like we're not going to just throw him in the post and say like, go back to the basket. You're not Tim Duncan. You're not David Robinson. You're a big wing. We want you to be able to operate on the perimeter. And so seeing them kind of draw things up, even if it's not that complicated, because every team's using zoom actions, but just seeing them use him in that way, it's refreshing, right? It's cool. It's like, okay, they're all bought in on this. Like, let's see what he can do as a wing. So even though it has been a little ugly at times, when things are working and they have the personnel out there to make it work, I've liked it. But again, like, that's kind of been few and far between this season. The offense has been, pretty ugly. I'm not going to lie to you. It's been pretty ugly.
But that's a really good point you bring up. I think my main lack of concern with his shot diet is mostly my trust in this coaching staff. I don't believe that Popovich could bring in a guy like this and would butt heads. Like, I don't believe that Wemby's out there taking shots that he's not allowed to take, or he's not been told, hey, go out there and do this. And for all intents and purposes, the mood on the floor seems to be the same way, in that they are not really having a situation where people seem upset with him as far as his teammates for the shots they take. If anything, they give him the ball to do those things. And overall, I feel like one of my favorite aspects about this team so far in the few games we've gotten is that he is that they are all playing together pretty well. Like everybody seems to have a great attitude. I think last year the ball kind of stuck a bit, and at least for watchers, that it was kind of frustrating to watch how the ball didn't really get to Wemby. But I think everybody plays really hard. They crash the boards. They, try really hard on defense, and they do try their best to get the ball to Wemby at least a little bit more frequently than they did last season. And those things point to, the fact that everybody in the room believes that this guy can do these things.
Yeah, that's well said.
Yeah, and I
And
think. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
well, no, I want you to hit on that, and then I want to talk about the defense as well, because he's generational, he's incredible, but I do think, or I want to hear from you if there's things you think he could improve on that end as well.
On the defensive end, absolutely. I do think he can get away with a lot because he's got an 8-foot wingspan and the ground coverage is unprecedented. And he's someone who is not just a rim protector, but a rim deterrent. Like guys come in the paint and they're like, "Oh no, I'm good," and they're immediately trying to kick it out so that they don't get their shots swatted into the third row. Can he get better on that end? Yes, I think there's a lot of times where Wemby can kind of fall asleep as a help defender. I think there are times where Wemby leaves his feet a little bit too early on, pump fakes inside the paint. And then there's also like the question of like how strong can Wembanyama get without negatively impacting his mobility. You know,
Mm-hmm.
he's pretty often bullied in the paint, and like sometimes it doesn't work because his length is able to negate that. Like you see him go against Ivica Zubac, or you see him go against Alperen Şengün, or you see him go against Jokic, and it's like those guys can beat him maybe like 50% of the time, where they're just able to body him and bury him under the rim, and then they're able to use the rim to protect their shot and finish there. But then the other half of the time, it's like, wow, like it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that he's not very strong because he's able to use that 8-foot wingspan and recover, and he's got a quick first jump, quick second jump, and he's able to, contest or block a shot. So how much of it matters, I'm not 100% sure, but could he get better? Absolutely, which is kind of a scary thought because I think and y'all can push back on this, but I would say at least as of today, there's not a more devastating defensive presence in the league right now outside of Wembanyama. I think Chet Holmgren is in that discussion. I think Anthony Davis is in that discussion when he's healthy. I even think Bam Adebayo deserves some credit there too, because he's one of the most switchable bigs I think we've ever seen play in the NBA. But I think you look at Wemby and it's like, I don't think anybody's matching him in that regard.
Yeah, I will say I think Chet is probably, in my eyes, maybe a half step more developed and well rounded in his presence on defense. And I think it goes a little underrated. And I think that's why people try him so often, is because they don't really expect him to be as defensively sound. And it does not work out for those people. But you're right that I do believe there's room for him to grow there. And while there's questions about how much stronger he can really get, just looking at how the human body works, and someone who's 21 years old right now, we imagine Wemby at 26 to 28, like he's going to be stronger in his own way, whether that just be from bone density, muscle growth, just aging. Like he hasn't really met the peak physically, from a conditioning standpoint, from a growth standpoint. And so it's going to be very interesting to see what that looks like. I don't think it's going to look anything like this, but I just oftentimes remember what Giannis used to look like when
Yes.
he
Yeah,
was
I was thinking
19
the
or
same
20
thing.
and what he looks like now. And if Wemby was able to do even a facsimile of that, it would be insane, because he's already so effective on both sides of the ball, but especially defensively.
Yeah, and Noah, I liked your point. Wemby's physical abilities almost, I think, trick him into thinking he can get away with more than he can. Like his agility and his ability to flip his hips when he's in drop coverage is unbelievable. But I feel like sometimes he does it when he doesn't really need to.
Yeah.
Like he could almost take a page out of like the Brooke Lopez book, where he's just squared up to the ball handler the whole time, and then he just throws it into the third row because there's nothing they can do. There was a play in the Portland game where Anthony Simons faked inside, Wemby completely turned around, and then Simon was able to go around him the other way. And it's just plays like that where he can do so much, but it's almost like if you do less, you might be in a better spot to kind of, compromise that offensive possession.
Definitely. I think schematically too, when I watch the Spurs, and I'm not saying they can't use Wemby in drop coverage, but I would love to see them get a little more aggressive and have him play at the level of the screen, hedge a little bit, hard hedge, like do something to put some pressure on the ball handlers too, because as of right now, especially playing with Chris Paul, and I hate to say this because Chris Paul is, future Hall of Famer. Definitely got to respect what he's done in his career, but he's basically been a traffic cone on defense. Like, he can't navigate screens anymore. If he gets caught on a screen, there's no recovering. Right in at 6 feet tall, you already are in the NBA at least. You're facing a pretty big uphill battle to not be a defensive liability. And this is a guy who was an all defensive guy pretty regularly during the early parts of his career. But at 40, he's just not going to have the wingspan to recover. He's not going to have the foot speed to recover. And if I'm being honest, at times it's kind of looked like once Chris Paul hits a screen, he's like, oh, well, move on to the next play. Like, he hasn't looked super interested in fighting back into plays. So I would just love to see them kind of use Wemby in a different way. And I know it feels like forever ago now, but especially in that opening game against the Mavericks, where they exclusively used Wemby in pretty deep drop coverage, that's not going to work against teams that can shoot. That's not going to work against teams that have a ball handler that can get wherever they want on the court. And just having Wemby do something other than just sit in the paint and just kind of let the fight come to him. I'd love to see them do that a little bit more, because I mean, what's the point of having someone who can, flip their hips and slide laterally and also contest threes? If you're not going to use him in that way, because I think he can add a lot of other pressure on the perimeter in that way if they were to use him that way. But for the most part, we have just seen him used as a guy in deep drop.
Yeah, it's crazy. Wemby is probably the only player in NBA history that can almost simultaneously show at the level and drop because of his length. There's some pick and rolls where I'm like, wow, he's really doing both there. Like, he can kind of you kind of, it's like you're being guarded by two guys. So yeah, he's the stuff they can do with him is incredible. And of course, a third of their game so far has come against Houston, so that's gonna skew some numbers and things. But it has been interesting to watch every Houston matchup. They have him in such a deep drop, and then Jalen Green and Van Fleet are dangerous pull-up shooters, so it's going to be interesting to see how the coaching staff kind of messes around with those different coverages through the season. So I'm glad you hit on that. That was something I wanted to ask you about. And speaking of kind of looking forward, obviously we're getting Vassell back, so that's exciting, but over just the next 10 games or so, what are you going to be looking for from San Antonio?
Yes, hopefully we can kind of get an idea of who they are as a team. I'm not saying that Stephon Castle is Jeremy Sohan, but he's I think close enough approximate as far as role goes, where he's sort of a jack of all trades, can be that short roll passer, can be a screener, can be a roll man, can be a guy who's cutting off ball, just high field player, right? I think he can be a close enough approximate to Sohan, not necessarily in efficiency, but in role, that once they have Devin Vassell back, and hopefully they get Trey Jones back here in a couple of days and Malachi Branham, we kind of get a better idea of what this team looks like when they're healthy. Obviously, we won't get 100% idea until Sohan comes back as well, but just having those guys on the floor, kind of getting that synergy together, seeing what else adding Devin Vassell to the playbook, or to the rotation, does for the playbook too. Because I think, as we talked about, when you're lacking personnel, you can't really turn to certain sets, because it's not like people are going to be, running out to the perimeter if you're running a pin down for Sohan or anything. You wouldn't run a pin down for Sohan. You wouldn't run a flare screen for Stephon Castle, because teams aren't going to react to that, right? They don't care that those guys
they would love for you
that.
to do that.
Actually, they would be fine if you did that.
First,
so having Devin Vassell out there, a guy who can do those things and also create for himself, I think that's huge, and that's what I'm looking for. Does this team look a little bit better offensively? And then in that same breath, Devin Vassell, can he continue to help them be a top 10 defense? Can he do that? Is that something? Because when he came out of Florida State, I don't think there was any question about his defensive chops. I think he was one of those guys that people were like, man, this is going to be one of the best team defenders in the NBA day one. And we saw a little bit of it his first season, but I feel like steadily, season after season after season, he's been less effective, less attentive. And, it's been great to see the offensive growth, but definitely been at the expense of what he showed he could do defensively at Florida State.
Yeah, his development track has almost been the inverse of what I would have expected. I thought he would pretty much just be a 3-and-D guy with no creation, and it's kind of gone the other way. Caelan, what will you be looking for over the next few games for San Antonio?
Yeah, so that's probably the biggest thing. And Liam, whenever you were saying that you weren't necessarily concerned about Wembyama's shot profile. It is very early, so they get Vassell back. I think ultimately figuring out the rotation. It's going to be tough with all these injuries, but that's probably the most important thing. Figuring out, how many minutes and who to pair with Chris Paul and who to pair with Wemby is going to be probably the biggest deal. So I'm just kind of going to be looking at that. But I think they're going to get shots to fall. I would like to see them play a little faster if that is possible, because I do think that's going to help Wemby just get into rhythm. So that's the main thing I'm looking for next 10 games.
Nice. Well, to close out here, Noah, I wanted to just kind of ask you from a more general standpoint, how are you watching these games? I feel like as we're all fans of the game, obviously, but we want to be, informed analysts. And I feel like we all kind of develop our own habits over time about how we actually take in this information. So I'd love to hear from you just kind of how that process has developed over time for you.
Yeah, so when I first started, I used to just kind of like watch games and then like right as I was going and then try to have something up as quickly as possible because I was like, man, I'm competing with, like the San Antonio Express News, with Pounding the Rock, with Air Alamo, with Project Spurs, with the San Antonio Current, with like all these local, outlets, right? And I was like, if I'm not in that like one of the first people publishing, I'm gonna get lost in the mix. And as time has gone on, I've been like, you know what? Most of that stuff when you're writing as the game is going on and you're publishing right away, it's really reactionary and it's not like really thought out. So as time has gone on, I've kind of tried to learn as much as I can about how the X's and O's work, defensive coverages, different actions and stuff out there. And so the first watch through of a game, I'll maybe like live tweet and take some notes here and there, but usually I won't post until the next morning because then I take a second watch of the game. So I'll watch the second time. I'll go through the game a second time, and then I'll go ahead and log every single set play that they do, whether that's following an ATO, whether it's a sideline out of bounds, baseline out of bounds after free throws. And from there, I'll just kind of go like, hey, like what was working for them, what wasn't working for them, and defensively, like where were they exploited or what were they doing well? What were they doing well? So the second watch through, I think, is always the biggest. Just watching it once, I don't think does the game justice because it's easy to miss things, especially when you're watching it live and like you don't ever want to, be pausing the game constantly and then you're like tweeting as that's happening and now you're way behind where everybody else is. So just kind of watch it organically the first time, take some notes, see what you've got, and then that second watch through really get into it deep, right? Like take as long as you need. Is that 2 hours? Is it 3 hours? Is it multiple sittings? Sometimes it is, but that's generally how I go through every game.
That's awesome. How would you say you've developed kind of your knowledge of the actual sets and play calls that are being called out there? Were you someone that played growing up, played collegiately, and do you talk to coaches, or kind of how have you developed your basketball knowledge, I guess?
Yeah, so I grew up loving basketball. I'm from San Antonio, so like the big three era of Timmy, Tony, Manu. Shout out Bruce Bowen as well. Like that was what really got me into basketball. And so growing up, I was like, I want to be a basketball player. I'm gonna be in the NBA. And then somewhere at middle school, I was like, yo, I'm like 5 feet tall. I don't think my hoops dream is gonna work out. I kept pursuing it up until high school. I tried out for the basketball team heading into my freshman year, and I got third string freshman team, and I was like, yeah, I'm cooked already. This is not going to work out for me. I think I like kind of understand some concepts, but most of the time, my background was like I had played in some like community, like Jewish community center leagues near me that were like close to me. And then I had played in some like Christian youth leagues that were near me, but never with coaches who were like, we're running this play, this. So I didn't have like a ton of knowledge of the game. Mine was just like your read, react. I didn't know a ton. But then when I really wanted to start kind of getting into things, especially when I went to the University of North Texas, I'd reached out to the coaching staff there and been like, is there any way I can just like kind of sit in on practices? Can I pick your brain sometime after a game? And thankfully they were really, really nice. Like, most people are, but like at the college level, they're willing, a lot of the coaches and a lot of the graduate assistants and stuff were willing to sit down and be like, yeah, like this is kind of how works. This is kind of what the terminology is. There's different terminology kind of based on the school sometimes, but it's pretty uniform for the most part across collegiate NBA and stuff. And then as I continue to move on, I was like, well, there's people on Twitter who like know their stuff. Like there are people who are on Twitter who know their stuff, right? Like who are coaches who have done a ton of research. So I started reaching out to them. Shout out to Evan Golberto. He's a guy who I have been following a long time. He's a guy who I've reached out to a lot in the past just to be like, hey, this is what I've seen. Does this kind of line up with your, decades of knowledge? And just doing the same thing with other guys and gals. You know, there's such a wealth of knowledge out there. Sometimes you just got to be willing to put yourself out there and be wrong, but ask questions. So that's really how I've built my sort of base of knowledge for different terminology for actions or defensive schemes or certain things that players might do on the court, from digging or stunting or X outs, those sort of things. Like just ask other people. Other people know. All you have to do is just ask. So that's how I've built it. Just trying to research on my own and then build on that research by reaching out, because people are willing to be helpful if you ask.
Man, that's really cool to hear, because that's honestly probably like my biggest thing where I'm at right now, and probably Lino and Micah too. We watch a ton of basketball. We didn't necessarily play at a high enough level to really get the schematics and the ins and out kind of drilled into us. So we don't know those things, and I'm always thinking, I feel like I've plateaued in my basketball knowledge. Like I watch a ton of the game, I listen to all the podcasts, and I follow the smart people, and I want to get smarter, but I feel like I can't like hit that next level. And there are, I'm starting to see people even younger than me that are doing some of this stuff, and they're like really, brilliant. They're like, some of these like sports almanac type kids that just always dove into that stuff. And so that's really cool to hear. I think I probably could be better about, maybe just trying to like connect with some of those people I see that are doing that really smart stuff. And so yeah, that's really cool to hear.
Man, I felt proud of myself for Googling what is horns a couple of years ago and watching a few YouTube videos of breaking it down and walking away from those YouTube videos still not really knowing what horns was. But that is such a great realization to come to, is that knowledge is so easily accessible from your peers and people who are happy to share those kind of things and want someone probably to be able to share those things with, as there's probably not a lot of people who come up to them wanting to know the deep in and out of basketball terminology. So that's awesome.
Yeah,
that is super cool. And of course, listeners, if you want to learn more about basketball, subscribe to the Vic and Roll Substack. I'm a subscriber myself. You will learn so much. Obviously, if you're a Spurs fan, you have to subscribe. But even as a Heat fan whose team has fallen to the San Antonio Spurs in the finals, I'm still able to appreciate what they're doing, and I learn a ton. Noah, what else should we be on the lookout for you? What different social media should we check out on? What do you have going on coming up?
Yeah, I mean, you can just find me on pretty much every platform at the Vic and Roll now. So like, I think I'm on the Vic and Roll on YouTube, on Substack, on Twitter. You can also follow my personal Twitter _Magaro, Magaro. But as for what's going on the what's on the horizon for me, just more to like film breakdowns, more mailbag type stuff. So if you ever have questions that you want to ask about the Spurs or about the NBA in general, I do mailbags. I try to do them at least once a week on my site. Ask a question. If I have time, I will absolutely try to get to as many as possible. And then I also do like game breakdown stuff as well, and I do scouting reports. So I try to post once or twice a week on my site. Sometimes life and my other job get in the way. So it can be a little bit irregular, but I will let everybody know. The Vic and Roll, everything on there, completely free. The only thing I ask is, if you really love it, consider being a paid subscriber. You're not going to get anything extra, but you will be supporting someone who is building a site from the ground up. But while the content is irregular and I can't make this full time, I will never make y'all pay for anything. So yeah, definitely check out the Vic and Roll.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Noah, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a super fun episode. We know everybody that listened in is really going to enjoy it. As always, for the Irrational Confidence fellas, check us out on TikTok, YouTube, Twitter. If you have any questions for us, shoot them to us at confidenceirrational@gmail.com. So for myself, my friends, and fellow hosts, Caelan and Lino, thank you for tuning in, and we will talk to you guys next time.